You have been taught that the world was conquered. Ships came, flags went up, and the people who were already there simply lost. That is the story you inherited. But the real story is far stranger. Because in the spring of 1521, on an island you have almost certainly never heard of, the most advanced military expedition on Earth waded ashore at dawn. They wore steel armor. They carried guns and crossbows. They had already crossed an ocean no European had ever crossed before, and waiting for them in the shallow water stood a man with no metal, no armor, and a sharpened length of bamboo. By the time the sun had fully risen, the man in steel was dead, and the man with the bamboo had earned a name that would outlive the empire that came to erase him. His name was Lapu-Lapu. Here is the first strange thing. You have probably already pictured him. A towering warrior, bare-chested, a sword raised over his head, frozen mid-roar like the giant bronze statues that stand in his honor today. Let that image go, because almost none of it is real. We do not know what Lapu-Lapu looked like. We do not know how tall he was, how old he was, or what his face looked like when he smiled. We are not even fully certain that Lapu-Lapu was the name his own people called him. Everything you can picture when you hear that name was added later, by generations who needed a hero and had almost nothing solid to carve one from. So how do we know he existed at all? The answer is almost unbelievable. We know him because of a single man who sailed on the other side. His name was Antonio Pigafetta, a young scholar from the Italian city of Vicenza, and he had talked his way onto the most ambitious voyage in human history. That voyage belonged to the explorer Ferdinand Magellan, who was attempting to sail all the way around the world. Pigafetta kept a journal. He wrote down what he ate, what he feared, the words of the languages he heard, and the day everything fell apart. That journal is the reason a man with a bamboo spear is remembered 500 years later. Think about that for a moment. The only eyewitness record of the first great hero of the islands was written by the people he was fighting against. Now, to understand why these two men met on that beach, you have to understand what Magellan wanted. By 1521, Magellan's fleet was starving. He had set out from Spain with 5 ships and roughly 270 men. He had crossed the Atlantic, threaded a freezing maze of channels at the bottom of South America, and then sailed into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. It was an ocean so wide his crew chewed leather and ate sawdust to stay alive. When his ships finally reached the islands we now call the Philippines, they were desperate for food, for allies, and for proof that the whole insane gamble had been worth it. And at first, it seemed to work. On the island of Cebu, Magellan met a powerful local ruler named Raja Humabon. Magellan offered friendship, trade, and the protection of the most powerful kingdom on earth. He also offered a new god. Humabon agreed to be baptized a Christian, and hundreds of his people followed. For Magellan, this was the dream: a foothold, a convert, a partner. But to seal the alliance, he made a promise that would kill him. He promised to punish anyone who refused to submit. Across a narrow channel sat a small island called Mactan, and on Mactan was a chief who said no. You have to picture how small this dispute looked from Magellan's side. Mactan was a sliver of land. Its people had no steel, no ships that could cross oceans, no gunpowder. To a man who had just conquered the largest ocean on the planet, crushing one stubborn island chief must have felt like swatting a fly. His own allies warned him it was not necessary. His own men suggested sending a smaller force. Magellan refused. He decided to lead the attack himself, in person, to show the islands exactly what European power looked like. This is where the historian William Henry Scott becomes important. Scott spent decades reconstructing what these islands were actually like before Europeans arrived, pulling fragments from old documents the way an archaeologist lifts pottery out of dirt. He called the few surviving sources cracks in the parchment curtain, tiny gaps you could peek through to glimpse a whole world that had been painted over. And what Scott found was that these were not simple, helpless villages. They were organized societies, led by chiefs called datus, with their own laws, trade networks, metalworking, and a long, fierce tradition of war. Lapu-Lapu was not a savage stumbling into history. He was a seasoned leader on his own ground, and he had already decided exactly how this fight would go. Consider the weapons themselves. The warriors of these islands fought with long, heavy swords called campilan, with fire-hardened bamboo spears, with iron-tipped lances, and shields of light wood. None of it could punch through European plate armor in a straight, head-on clash. But Lapu-Lapu was not planning a straight clash. He was planning to use the beach, the reef, the falling tide, and the sheer weight of numbers to turn the invaders' greatest strength against them. This was not luck. It was a plan, drawn up by a man who knew his own water better than any map Magellan owned. Because here is what Lapu-Lapu understood that Magellan did not. The water. On the morning of April 27, 1521, Magellan loaded around 49 of his men into small boats and rowed toward Mactan in the dark. But the sea around the island was guarded by something no sword could cut, a wide, shallow reef. When the boats reached it, the water was too low and too rocky to cross. The big ships and their cannons had to anchor far out, useless. So Magellan and his armored men climbed out and began to wade. They crossed a long stretch of water on foot, in heavy steel, under a rising sun, toward a beach that was anything but empty. Waiting for them, by Pigafetta's own count, were more than 1,000 warriors. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating scenes in all of history. And we have it almost word for word, because Pigafetta stood close enough to watch his captain die. The Spanish fired their guns and crossbows from too far away, and the shots fell weak in the distance. The warriors of Mactan did not panic. They had seen the armor. They understood that the chest and the head were protected, so they aimed at the legs. They rained spears, stones, and arrows at the one place the steel did not cover. Magellan's men began to fall. The line broke. And the men in armor, so terrifying on a European battlefield, found themselves trapped in shallow water, too slow to retreat and too exposed to advance. Magellan was struck in the leg with a bamboo spear. Then a blade caught him in the arm. Pigafetta describes how the warriors recognized the captain and swarmed him, how he turned back again and again to make sure his men could reach the boats, and how he finally went down into the water under a crowd of attackers. The greatest navigator of his age, the man who would prove you could sail around the entire world, died face down in knee-deep water off an island he thought too small to matter. And Lapu-Lapu? After that morning, he vanishes. This is the second strange thing, the part almost no one tells you. We have this vivid, unforgettable account of the battle, and then nothing. We do not know when Lapu-Lapu died. We do not know how. The Filipino historian Ambeth Ocampo has pointed out again and again that the hero on the statues, the face on the souvenirs, the warrior frozen in bronze, all of it is imagination. We do not have his portrait. We barely have his name. He stepped out of the historical record at the very moment he stepped into legend. And there is one more twist, the hardest one to sit with. Did winning that battle actually save his islands? No. Not in the way you might hope. Magellan's death did not end the expedition's story cleanly. A few days later, Raja Humabon, the very ally Magellan had baptized, turned on the surviving Europeans and killed many of them at a feast. The battered remnants of the fleet fled. In the end, just one ship and 18 starving men out of the original 270 made it home to Spain, becoming the first people to travel all the way around the world. And 40 years after that, Spain came back. This time, they did not leave. They would rule the islands for more than 3 centuries. So, in the cold arithmetic of conquest, Lapu-Lapu did not stop the tide. The empire he defeated on that beach eventually swallowed his entire world. And yet his is the name that survived. Today, the airport where millions of travelers land to visit those islands sits on Mactan itself, on the very ground where the battle was fought. A city there carries his name. A common fish served at dinner tables across the country is called Lapu-Lapu. Children learn him as the first man to look at the most powerful force in the known world and refuse to kneel. The scholar Resil Mojares, who spent his life studying the history of Cebu, described how a people reaches back into its past and chooses which fragments to turn into meaning. Out of almost nothing, a few paragraphs in an enemy's diary, an entire nation built a symbol of dignity that no empire was ever able to take away. So ask yourself what actually wins in the long run. Is it the steel? Is it the ships, the guns, the flags planted in the sand? Magellan had all of it, and history remembers him most of all for the morning he lost. Lapu-Lapu had a reef, 1,000 neighbors, and the refusal to believe that bigger automatically means stronger.